there, welcome. Thank you for joining me. My name's Carolyn Pitts. For over 25 years, I've been a health coach certified by the American Council on Exercise, and I'm also trained as an energy healer. Every week, I post content to help you be your best self, body, mind, and spirit. Today, we're going to talk about meal sequencing. What is that, and why should you care? Well, if you're interested in trying to control your weight, or if you are concerned about your blood sugar levels, maybe you have a history of diabetes in your family, or your doctor has warned you about high blood sugar, or you've even been diagnosed with prediabetes, I think you're going to want to hear about this. I'm going to start by telling you about a study that was done by Cornell back in 2019, and this study was published in a journal called Diabetes, Obesity, and Metabolism. So what they did in this study is they took participants who had been diagnosed with prediabetes, which is an elevated blood sugar state between a healthy blood sugar level and full-blown type 2 diabetes. And they had them eat a meal that consisted of a green salad with olive oil and vinegar dressing, a skinless chicken breast, and bread. They measured their blood sugar and their insulin before they ate the meal. Then they had 30 minutes to consume the meal, at which time their blood sugar and their insulin was measured again, and then continuing at 30-minute intervals. So 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 120 minutes, 150 minutes, and 180 minutes. And then they mapped out what happened to their blood sugar and their glucose over time. Their blood sugar and their insulin over time. If you watched my video from last week, you know that it's really important to manage the flow of blood sugar, glucose, and insulin because we want it to be as smooth as possible. We want to avoid high spikes in blood sugar and insulin, because over time, a spike like that, continuous over time, can lead to insulin resistance, which leads to all kinds of health complications. I talked about that in the last video. But what they did with these participants is they had them eat the same meal again a week later, and then again a week later. So they ate the same meal 3 times with a week in between. But here's what they did different. And they did this in random order. One time when a participant came in, they would eat the bread first, then they would wait 10 minutes, and then they would finish up with the chicken and the salad, eating those together in the time that was remaining in that first 30-minute interval. Another time they came in, they would eat the chicken and the salad together, wait 10 minutes, and then eat the bread. And then the third time, or another of the 3 times they came in, they would have the salad first, wait 10 minutes, and then have the chicken and the bread together. So here's what they found out. When participants ate the bread at the end of the meal, they experienced less of a spike in their glucose and in their insulin level. As you can see here on the chart, it's quite significant. I'm going to read you a quote from the conclusion of the study. And this is a quote. These effects are plausibly mediated by slowed carbohydrate absorption due to the effects of fiber and fat in the vegetable first meal order, although more work is needed to clearly delineate these mechanisms. This intervention has practical relevance since the idea of having a salad with dressing before the main course can easily be implemented within diverse cultural settings and meal patterns. It's really interesting because it used to be all the time when you went to a restaurant, you would have the salad before you had your entree. But they would also put the bread on the table first. So kind of interesting when we think about, what our customs are and the difference that it can make when we're eating foods in a specific order. And again, there was a pause between those foods. So they weren't eating them all together, but they were letting the vegetables with the oil and vinegar, which is fat from the oil, get into the stomach and start being digested before the other foods came in behind. Now, I've talked about when you're looking at scientific studies, some things to take into consideration would be how many people participated, how long did the study go on, who funded the study, was it published in a reputable peer-reviewed journal, who paid for it. So one of the drawbacks with this particular study is that there were only 15 participants. And from a time frame perspective, it's kind of a short time frame because even though it went on for a couple weeks, they just came in and ate that one meal. So you don't know really what the effect of the vegetable first meal would have over an extended period of time. So I went digging a little bit deeper, and the next report I want to share with you, this is actually a meta-analysis, which is when they look at a conglomeration of studies and they say, okay, let's look at all these studies and kind of what conclusions can we come to based on the individual conclusions. How can we, what can we conclude when we look at all those studies together? And so this meta-analysis was published in the Journal of American Nutrition Association in 2023. And it's a meta-analysis of 11 studies. What I could not find, because the actual analysis is behind a paywall, so I don't know if their meta-analysis included the Cornell study or not, but their conclusion from these 11 studies that they looked at, findings indicate, I'm quoting, at least acutely, there may be benefits to eating carbohydrate after vegetable and or protein-rich foods. The most consistent effect, judged as moderate certainty, is that carbohydrate last meal orders tend to lower blood glucose and insulin excursions. And so insulin excursion, they're basically talking about whether it spikes or not. It's lowering the, you're going to see some elevation of blood sugar and insulin in your bloodstream after you eat a meal, but what you want is a nice gentle slope, not a high spike. And so they're saying that carbohydrate last seems to show that. All right, the next study that I want to talk about, and this is out of Japan. Again, this was a meta-analysis. And in this particular analysis, this was done in 2020. It was published in a journal called Nutrients. And it is a meta-analysis, again, of 7 studies. And with this study, they started to look at not just looking at blood sugar and insulin, but looking at something called GLP-1, which stands for glucagon-like peptide 1. And this particular substance is important because it helps us feel full, helps us feel satiated, it helps control our appetite. It delays what's called gastric emptying. So it takes longer for us to digest a meal. And when we can eat a meal and take longer to digest it, then that's going to be a longer period of time till we start to feel hungry again. And then GLP-1 also has protective effects on the heart, the kidneys, and the nervous system. So their conclusion in looking at the 7 studies that they evaluated, and I'm going to quote, many studies have found that preloading nutrients such as fat, protein, and fiber before carbohydrate can ameliorate postprandial glucose elevation. So postprandial glucose elevation, that basically is how your glucose or your blood sugar goes up after you eat. It goes on to say, indeed, it has been reported that adherence to a meal sequence program is better than that to a nutritional balance program. So in other words, when we tell people, well, these are the foods you should eat for nutrition and these are the foods you should avoid, it's a lot easier for people to adhere to a plan when they've just been told eat the carbohydrates last than when they've been told what foods to focus on and what foods to perhaps avoid. And then the other thing was that interventions focusing on meal sequence facilitate secretion of GLP-1, which has the property of inhibiting appetite, suggesting that long-term interventions on meal sequence may lead to prevention or improvement of obesity. So with the GLP-1 consideration coming into this particular meta-analysis, now we're not looking at just what's the effect on blood sugar and insulin resistance, but we're also looking at what's the effect on body weight and body weight gain. All right, so one more study I wanted to tell you about, and all of these studies are linked in the description, so you can go read all the details for yourself. This last one was a meta-analysis of 30 studies. This was done by a researcher in Australia. It was published in a journal called Frontiers in Endocrinology in 2019, and it does include the Cornell study. And one of the things I thought was really interesting about this particular meta-analysis is it started to pull out all the ways these studies are different because they were looking at 30 different studies in this particular meta-analysis. So of the different studies that have been done looking at eating carbohydrates last in meal sequencing, some of these studies were done with people who have prediabetes, like the Cornell study. Some have been done with healthy participants. Some have been done with people who have diabetes, type 2 or type 1. And some have been done with women who are experiencing gestational diabetes. So there's some variance there in the degree of health or blood sugar concern for the people participating in the study. Another way that the studies varied is what they used as what I'll call the preload meal. So what were they consuming first? You know, in the Cornell study, I talked about when they ate the bread last, they started with a green salad that had oil and vinegar on it. So I've got some fiber, I've got some fat in the oil, and then I've got the chicken which is protein, before they ate the bread. But in these 30 different studies, the preload were a lot of different things. Sometimes they had them drink a whey shake. Sometimes they had them eat a high fiber bar. Sometimes they used milk, either dairy or plant-based milk. So the particular food uh, content of the protein, fat, veg, or combo or fiber that was used as the preload varied quite a bit. And then the actual test meal. In the Cornell study, they ate some bread. They had a piece of ciabatta. But these other studies, the test meal it was carbohydrate laden, but it was different foods and different amounts of food. So that's a way that these studies, again, it's hard to compare them and contrast them because it's a little bit of apples and oranges. One of the things that I noticed, they didn't call it out, but it didn't really talk about food preparation. So in the Cornell study, we know they were eating a raw, leafy green salad, but in some of the other studies, it just said veg, and I don't really know how those veggies were prepared. Were they also raw, or were they perhaps cooked? Because that could affect the fiber content. And length of study. I talked about the Cornell study was, just over the course of 3 meals with a week in between. But scanning across the list of 30 studies in this particular meta-analysis, the longest one went on for just a couple weeks. I think it was gestational diabetes, and it went on for 9 weeks. So we haven't really done any long-term analysis. So we can't really say, can people sustain eating carbs last? And what might that do to other health indicators besides blood sugar, glucose, GLP-1? What other factors might be influenced over a period of time if you're always eating the carbohydrate foods last in your meal? But all that said, I will read to you from their conclusion of the meta-analysis, which says, the experimental evidence discussed above indicates that pre-meal consumption of protein and fat can markedly reduce postprandial glycemia across the whole spectrum of glucose tolerance. From the clinical perspective, the glucose-lowering effect of nutrient preloads is comparable in magnitude to that of current anti-hyperglycemic drugs, is proportionally greater in type 2 diabetes than pre-diabetic and non-diabetic subjects, and appears to be sustained over time. Preload-based dietary strategies can be useful in the management of type 2 diabetes, either alone or in combination with pharmacological treatments due to their additive effects. Which leads me to a really important point that I want to make, and that is that if you have high blood sugar, whether you have diabetes or you have prediabetes or you just have blood sugar concerns, talk to your doctor before tackling this particular technique of meal sequencing, because if it can indeed affect your blood sugar as well as the pharmacological substances that you're taking, then you want to be sure that you're managing your medication appropriately when you change your eating habits. Don't just watch a YouTube video and decide you're going to manage this yourself. Diabetes, blood sugar, very serious. Talk to your doctor first. If this content appeals to you, I encourage you to join my intention circle by going to intendwell.us and signing up for my newsletter. Every Friday, I send you a link to my content for the week, so you'll never miss a video. And if you have any questions or comments for me, please leave them in the comments down below. If you have any suggestions for future videos or topics that you'd like me to cover, let me know. And maybe it'll be something I can do in a future video. Thank you for your time and attention. Have a beautiful rest of your day, and remember to intend well.